Hello folks, Peter Lawn here. This is part 2 of the changes and additions I've made to the NMS Util Blender plugin that was incorporated into version 1.15. You can get the latest version from my GitHub page at the URL shown. This video takes a closer look at the reworked Object Along Curve module, which now features some handy curve creation routines. Why do we care about curves? Well, you can always wow your audience with a really nice curves in your builds, and here's some examples of things that I've created in the past that make your building stand out. This utility makes this process way easier. The native NMS plugin has a duplicate along curve function, but the one I created gives you more control of orientation and spacing of objects along the curve. If you look at the Object Along Curve menu, you will now notice a new menu item at the top called Build Curve Shape. It offers a drop-down with some pre-configured curve shapes to get you started. The workflow of the module basically breaks down like this. Number 1, you create your curve. Number 2, modify and adjust the curve to your needs. Number 3, add an object to the scene and create the objects along the curve. And number 4, adjust orientation and spacing of the objects along the curve, and bingo, you're done. The menu is dynamic and it will change based on available actions depending on what stage you're in and what kind of curve you're working with. Let's slow this down and walk you through the process in more detail. We'll start with an easy curve first called the arc. There's a span value you can enter which will basically control how wide the arc is going to be. Let's pick 20 for now, and we'll build the curve by clicking the Build Curve button. You will see the arc curve has been placed wherever the 3D cursor is located, in this case the center of my scene. So now that I have a curve object selected, you will notice the menu has changed slightly, allowing me to toggle between Edit and Object mode, as well as the ability to resize the arc. So it's time to revisit some terminology with regards to curves. You'll have noticed that the curve looks a lot different when you go into Edit mode versus Object mode. By the way, you can also toggle between Edit and Object mode by hitting the Tab key with your mouse cursor in the 3D window area. I just added the button in the menu for convenience. When you're in Edit mode, you will notice these arrows along the line. I like to call them the herringbones, as well as these varying number of 3 vertices called control points. In our case, we have 3 of these to form the arc. And each control point of a curve consists of a center point and 2 handle points on either side. Grabbing and moving the center point of a control point has a different effect on the curve section than grabbing and moving the handles on either side of it. You need to play with these points to get the hang of what they can do, but like other objects in the game, you can move, rotate, and resize these points when you're in Edit mode to have different effects on the curve. Selecting the center control point and moving it along the y-axis, do this by hitting the G key for the move and followed immediately by the Y key for the axes, will increase my arc height, whereas selecting both handles and say resizing them with the S key will change the slope shape of the curve. I'll switch to top-down view using the numpad 7 key, and I'll select these bottom handles and rotate them. Hit the R key for rotation and get a different shape effect. Once we're satisfied with the shape, let's drop an object down that we want to follow along the curve we just created. Oh, and by the way, this threw me for a loop, but the No Man's Sky plugin menu will completely disappear if you're in Edit mode. Just switch back to Object mode to bring it back. I'm going to drop down a wedge object to work with. To create the objects along the curve, simply select both the object and the curve. You can do this with the Shift key and the left mouse button, and click the Create button in the module. What this does is duplicate our original object multiple times and adds a curve constraint to the object's position at regular intervals along the curve. You can see the constraints to those objects by looking at the collections area in the upper right window here, and by the objects that have a little blue constraint icon next to them. You can adjust the spacing of the objects along the curve by adjusting the increment value, then click the left or right arrows here. I added these 2 buttons called Objects, All Objects, and Curve in the Selection section to allow you to select just the curve or the objects constrained by the curve. Simply select any constrained object, any object associated with the curve, or the curve itself to perform this action. The reason this is useful is that you want to maybe delete all of these objects and start again with the original curve intact. You can select any object along the curve, click All Objects, which will select all the objects associated with that curve, and now just hit Delete on your keyboard to get rid of them. It's also advantageous to be able to just select the curve only. For example, if I wanted to rotate this curve and all its constrained objects, I just need to rotate the curve only and all the objects will follow. Or I can even go back into edit mode and continue to adjust the curve shape to see what effect it will have on the objects following it. For this next trick, make sure you have the transform orientation drop down in the 3D window set to local and the pivot point drop down next to it set to individual origins. You can change the orientation of any number of objects along the curve by selecting the objects only and then rotating at predefined increments along the X, Y, or Z axis. If you want finer control, you can do it manually by clicking R for rotate, then followed by the X, Y, or Z keys for the axes, and then fine tune with the mouse to exactly position where you want the objects to go, and then left mouse click to complete the action. Remember, the undo button, Control plus Z or Z, is your friend in case you have to go back. I've also added a cool feature to allow you to completely remove the curve and object constraints without deleting the objects or their relative positions in the scene. This is very handy because let's say this curve assembly is part of a larger base development and you need to move everything over somewhat. If you try that, selecting everything and moving it with the curve and constrained objects, you get this weird result showing up and it messes the 3D space up with all these lines going everywhere. Simply select any object along the curve and click the delete button, and the curve along with the object constraints will be deleted. Be sure you want to do this as it will eliminate your ability to make any further curve shape or spacing adjustments. So it's kind of like the final step you would do. Let's quickly look at one of the curve options called the spiral curve. It's a little different and warrants some discussion. This option doesn't immediately build a curve object, but rather creates a spiral object that further needs some parameter adjustment before you can convert it into a curve. Once you've satisfied with the shape, click Build Curve, and you'll see a connecting line that joins the beginning and the end of the spiral, which is necessary to keep the objects following along the spiral curve properly. We'll add our object and then create the objects along this curve by simply selecting both the object and the curve and click the Create button on the module. We can delete the objects in the connector and then make final adjustments as necessary for a beautiful spiral object set. Final step, you can delete the curve and the constraints on the objects.